When I was young, my grandfather liked to sit on the porch in the quiet hours after dinner, a cup of tea cooling in his hand, and spin tales about the past. Some of them were true. Some of them were only half true. And some of them, well, even he admitted they were lies. But he smiled when he told them, as though lies might carry a different kind of truth. The strangest one was about the Middle Ages. He said that back then, in the castles and stone halls of Europe, the kings were not wise rulers or noble warriors, but rather great gluttons, eating themselves into madness. He described banquets where the food was not roasted meat or fine bread, but monstrous heaps of spoiled stew, crawling with worms, glowing green with mold, yet swallowed down with joy. He said kings wore crowns of gold but lived in filth, drooling as they devoured the very things that would kill them. Of course, it was absurd. History books told a different story. Knights, lords, ladies, feasts, sure, but never anything like that. It was so ridiculous that, as a child, I laughed every time he told it. But the way he told it, slowly, almost gently, as though describing a memory, always left me unsettled. Years later, when I was grown, I realized something strange. That particular story had taken root in me. At first it was only a joke I repeated to friends. Did you know? I would say, that medieval kings ate moldy food on purpose. They laughed. It sounded ridiculous, and that was the point. But after a while, I caught myself wondering where my grandfather had heard it. Had he read it somewhere? Had someone told him? The more I thought about it, the more I wanted to know. The trouble with stories, even absurd ones, is that they leave questions behind. And questions don't like to be ignored. One autumn afternoon, I drove out to the old town library, the one that smelled of dust and varnish, where the windows were always half fogged. I asked the librarian, an older woman named Mrs. Carter, if she had any strange books about the Middle Ages. She smiled knowingly, as though she'd been asked stranger things, and led me to a shelf tucked in the corner. There I found books of legends, strange customs, and forgotten tales. Most of them were filled with stories of knights and miracles, witches and saints, but one slim volume caught my eye. Its title was Banquets of Folly. The pages were yellowed, and the words inside were written in an old, almost playful style. It told of kings who ate themselves sick, nobles who competed in contests of gluttony, and feasts where the food was so rotten it dripped with decay. There was even a painting, crude but haunting, of a crowned man gnawing on something that looked less like a roast and more like a lump of dirt covered in worms. I sat there for hours reading, frowning, then laughing at how absurd it all was. And yet, the pictures, the descriptions, they lingered. When I left, Mrs. Carter asked, "Find what you were looking for?" I nodded, but I wasn't sure. That night, I dreamed of the painting. The king was larger than life, his crown too heavy for his head. He sat at a table of stone, chewing with great delight on food that was clearly rotten. But in the dream, there was no disgust. There was only joy, pure, foolish joy, as though the spoiled feast was the finest meal ever made. When I woke, I felt oddly calm. The absurdity of it struck me, yes, but I also felt a strange kind of pity. Perhaps the story wasn't really about kings eating rotten food. Perhaps it was about how people can convince themselves of anything, how hunger, greed, or even loneliness can make the most ridiculous things seem good. My grandfather's Lee wasn't about the Middle Ages at all. It was about us. A week later, I returned to my grandfather's house. He was older now, his voice thinner, his tea often left untouched. But when I mentioned the old story, his eyes lit up. "You remember that?" he asked, his smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Of course," I said. "But where did it come from? Did you make it up?" He leaned back thoughtful. "Not exactly. My father told it to me, and his father to him. It's one of those things passed down, like a family heirloom. It doesn't matter if it's true. What matters is what it makes you feel." I thought of the painting, the dream, the strange pity I'd felt. "It makes me feel sad," I admitted. "Good," he said softly. "That means you understand it." I began to tell the story differently after that. No longer just a joke, but a tale with weight. I would say, there was a time, or so they claimed, when kings ate spoiled food as though it were treasure. They thought it was wealth, but it was only waste. They thought it was power, but it was only hunger. And they smiled as they ate, never realizing how foolish they looked. People still laughed, but then they grew quiet. They understood in their own way, because the truth behind the absurd lie was simple: we all do it. We all cling to things that harm us, believing they give us strength. We all eat our own kind of spoiled food, whether it's a habit, a fear, or a dream we refuse to let go of. The story was never about kings or castles. It was about the human heart. One evening, months later, I visited my grandfather again. The sun was low, painting the fields gold. We sat on the porch, sipping tea together. He was quiet for a long time, his eyes fixed on the horizon. Finally, he said, "Do you know why I told you that story so many times?" "Because it's funny," I guessed. He shook his head. "Because I wanted you to remember it. Lies are like seeds. Some grow into weeds, but some grow into something useful. You see, the absurd lie about the Middle Ages isn't really about history. It's about remembering to look at your own table, your own plate, and ask yourself, what am I really feeding on?" I felt a warmth in his words, the kind that stays long after the moment passes. The truth was, I had spent years chasing answers, searching dusty books, and puzzling over that ridiculous tale. And in the end, it had given me something far more valuable than facts. It had given me a way to see. Now, whenever I sit down to dinner, I sometimes think of that crowned king in his dark hall, smiling as he ate his moldy feast. And instead of laughing, I pause. I look at the food before me, fresh and warm, and I think of all the ways we choose what to consume, not just with our mouths, but with our lives. It is perhaps the most absurd lie ever told about the Middle Ages. But sometimes, the absurd lies are the ones that carry the deepest truths, and so I pass it on to you, not as history, not as fact, but as a reminder. The next time you find yourself holding onto something rotten, something that harms you but feels comforting, remember the gluttonous king. Remember the crown that weighed him down, the feast that gave him nothing. And choose better.